If you like what you're listening to, support this podcast on Patreon. Patreon.com, search Phil Dawson, or find a link in the show notes and join up. It's very much appreciated. Thank you for listening. Chapter 34, Urza and Mishra. Urza was alone at his camp. The aides and apprentices had fled or had rushed elsewhere as reinforcements or had been killed in combat. Below him, across the haze-filled valley, was a sea of mechanized ruin. Most of the smaller automatons had been smashed now, and only the great behemoths were thundering against each other. An oily smoke covered most of the land, and he could not see the opposite side of the valley any longer. Urza removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. So much effort, he thought, for so little result. Tanos was out there, he knew, but Tanos had fought before and always returned home. Harbin was at least safe from this battle and wrote to Penregon. Urza realized he should leave now, should pull back. But pull back to what? The forts had been emptied to bring troops to this battle. There was nothing left in the combined kingdoms to send. Even if the boatyards were still functional, there was nothing left of the land which was to build anew. Urza looked out over the vale and shook his head. He thought of Lauren's notes. He thought of Harbin. The boy had seen what the natives of this land could do and had come to believe there were more powerful forces than just artifice and machinery. Perhaps he was right, but it was too late for that. There was movement to Urza's right, and he turned, expecting to see Tanos stepping out of the gathering smoke. Instead, it was another figure, this one muscular and young and dressed in the robes of the desert. "Hello, brother," said Mishra. Urza blinked. Mishra looked unchanged from when they had last met face to face at Krug. Indeed, if anything, he looked younger, stronger, and more confident. Instinctively, Urza's hand went to the mightstone hanging from around his neck. "You're looking unwell," said Mishra, a cold smile on his face. "Your machines have sucked life out of you. That is your era. One of many." Mishra took a step forward, and Urza's stone began to glow. The pouch around Mishra's neck began to shine in response. Mishra opened it with his left hand and pulled the fist-sized rock from it. "Two of a kind," said the younger brother. "How long have we fought? And for what, brother? For trinkets such as these?" He pulled out the Ankh with his other hand. "For rulership of nations and people?" I just wanted to learn," said Urza softly. I just wanted to build my devices." Mishra took another step forward, and Urza tried to push the younger brother back, forcing his will through the stone, as he had at Krug, as he had back in Tokasia's camp at the beginning of his life. He was less effective this time. Mishra took another step forward, slower this time, and his smile was fixed and brittle. "You've let yourself grow old, and your light is dimming," he said. "Shall we talk one last time, or must I slay you now?" "You still want my stone," said Urza, but it was exhausting to speak. He felt age resting on his shoulders, and the stone as a great weight around his neck. Mishra took another step, and both brothers were bathed in the light now, the multicolored light from their own stones. The two men were only a foot apart. "You think this is only about a mere fractured gem? You think that this is where power is?" Mishra said, and there was effort in his smile. "You still covet my stone, brother? Here, take it!" Mishra lashed out with the stone gripped tightly in his hand. Urza dodged to one side, but knew as he dodged that Mishra's attack was merely a feint. The Ankh in Mishra's other hand came up suddenly, and Urza twisted and stumbled backward, trying to get out of the way of the blade. The light of his stone died as the razor-sharp edge of the Ankh streaked across his forehead. Urza's face exploded in pain as he fell back. Mishra laughed, and Urza reached up to his face. The Ankh had carved a deep furrow across his forehead, which already welled with blood. The thick, sticky fluid ran down the sides of Urza's face and stained his glasses with a sanguine hue. "You never realized true power, brother," taunted Mishra.
You never had to fight for your life. You were always safe in your world of devices and calculations. Now you see you went down the wrong path. You'll die old and alone, and I will take your lands and peoples and inventions and bend them to my will."
Mishra leaned forward to deliver a killing blow with his ankh. Urza felt anger, hot and fresh. With that anger came action. Were he thinking rationally, he might have tried to retreat, to talk, to plan another assault at a later day. But he was in pain, and anger welled from that pain. He moved instinctively and impulsively. He dropped the defenses he had erected around him, defenses that had blossomed when the two fought. Instead, he used the energy of the stone to launch a direct assault against his brother. He used the Might Stone as a force for his assault, but poured it into his anger at Mishra. He poured all his rage and all his other emotions as well. How he loved his brother, how he hated him, how their war had wrecked the lives in their world. All this he poured through the stone in one blast of energy. And as he did so, he felt something give within him. It was as when a muscle suddenly pulled from strain or gear changed within a device. Suddenly, the mental walls around him fell away, and he realized his brother had been right. He had never realized true power. Until now. Urza knew the power came from within him, not from any device or crystal. He fed that power through the stone and into a single bolt against his brother. Mishra's chest exploded in a ball of crimson fire, and the younger man screamed and fell. The fire spread through his robes as he flailed his arms, and the flames engulfed him. His body blazed brightly for a moment, then he was gone, fleeing back into the smoke that filled the valley. Urza watched him flee and now realized what had made Mishra so powerful. For Mishra's robes had burned in Urza's assault, and with the robes, the flesh beneath him had peeled away from the heat. Beneath the flesh had been metal. Urza had seen it for only a moment, but that was enough. There were plates where Mishra's ribs should have been, and pulleys and coiled knots of steel rope where his muscles should have operated. His brother had been consumed by his own machines. He had become one himself. Urza felt the effects of his own assault. Something had changed within him, and once the door was open, it could not be closed. He could sense the world around him by more than sight and feeling. He could feel the power within himself and the power within the land that surrounded him. The land was in pain. No, not just in Argoth, but in all of Terrasair. He and his brother had plundered the earth for its riches and damaged it almost beyond repair. Now it cried out to him in a maddening chorus, crying for respite, crying for release. There was another flicker of motion to his left, and he raised the Might Stone against the new assault. But this time it was Tawnos, staggering out of the smoky fog, coughing and clutching a backpack. The student looked ancient as he staggered forward. "Urza," said the former apprentice, "the machines no longer obey." Urza looked over the battlefield and saw it with new eyes. Where before there was confusion, he now saw another puppeteer, pulling the strings of his own artifact creatures, the strings of his brother. His own strings. "There was a demon, a creature from Phyrexia," continued Tawnos. "He ambushed me and Ashnod. Ashnod said I should bring you this." He pulled a bowl-shaped silex from the pack. "Urza, are you listening?" Urza looked at the bowl and heard the cries of the land around them. "I hear," he said, "more than you realize now. I hear." "We should retreat," said Tawnos. "Get away from here. If your brother finds us—" "My brother has been here once," said Urza, "and he will be coming back." He took the bowl from Tawnos' hands, and as he touched the silex, the cries of the land became more intense in his ears. They rose in a deafening cacophony of pain that only he could hear. "Ashnod said you're supposed to fill it with memories of the land," said Tawnos. The scholar's mouth worked a moment, then added, I don't know what that means." "I know," said Urza. And he did know. The moment he took the bowl from Tawnos, he knew what its purpose was and how he was to use it. The understanding flowed through him like an electric jolt. "We should go," said Tawnos. "No," said Urza, softly. "Urza, you're hurt," began Tawnos, but Urza cut him off. "No," he repeated. "It ends here, for me and for him." For a moment, his eyes focused on Tawnos, and Urza said, "You must go and find a safe refuge.
Find some place to take cover.
Urza, I'm not...
Do not argue, thundered Urza, and his eyes flashed with rage. Find the deepest cave, the furthest tree, the strongest fortification. Find anything to protect yourself, and do it now!
Tanos was gone, and Urza was alone on the hillside. Only for a moment, for there was a clanking and clattering to his right, down toward the valley. The noise grew louder by the moment. Mishra was returning, and he had brought the Dragon engine with him. The mists parted as the great machine rumbled up the hill toward the wounded scholar, and Urza mentally corrected himself. Mishra had brought the Dragon engine as part of himself. Most of the flesh had burned away from his brother's form, leaving only a maze of coiled wire and black cables beneath, oozing fluid. The cables had reached out from within his body and merged with those of the Dragon engine. This one had been the one at Corlinda, and similar cables had extruded from it to join with Mishra. Machine and man had become one entity. Mishra's face was largely intact, save for a long, burned scar along one side. The tatters of flesh flapped against the metal beneath as his mechanical jaw opened and closed, bellowing threats. There was a dripping redness along the side that might have been blood. Urza saw the abomination that was his brother and knew what must be done. He spoke a word and pulled the energies of the land to him. In an instant, the hillside at his feet slid away, crashing toward the Mishra engine. The man-machine was caught by the cascading earth and dragged backward down toward the valley floor. It would not stop his hate-filled brother, Urza realized, but it would slow him down, and that was enough. Urza sat cross-legged with the bowl in his lap. The runes within the bowl spiraled toward the center, but he did not need to read them. Whatever force now coursed through his veins allowed him comprehension, allowed him to commune with the artifact as he now heard the cries of the land. Blood from the gushing wound on his forehead dribbled into the bowl and filled the carved runes with crimson. Urza summoned his memories, the memories of his life and his studies, and willed them into the bowl. He thought of Argiv and of Corliss. He thought of his towers and workshops and of the Orniary and Krug. He thought of lands he had flown over and fought over. He thought of the Kur ridges and the caverns of Koilos. And he thought of a small encampment, now forgotten by most living men and buried by sand, where students of an old woman dug for artifacts of an ancient, forgotten people, where two brothers learned about the Thran. The Mishra machine had recovered from the avalanche and was now charging up the hill, its dragon head screaming. Urza looked up and saw his brother's face, half torn from the metallic skull beneath, and wept for him. The artificer's tears joined the blood and memories in the bowl, and he felt the power well up around him. The power filled him now, flowing to him from all the lands and all the memories of the things that he had done. His regrets and pride and anger and solitude all poured into the bowl, filling it to the brim, filling it to the bursting point, and beyond. The Mishra machine had attained the hilltop now, and its serpent head loomed high above him. Mishra was grinning, his smile half flesh and half steel. It was the grin of a man triumphant. Mishra was screaming something, but Urza no longer heard his voice. All he heard was the land, crying for release. And Urza released the power. A flash at the base of the bowl spread outward and upward. A new sun brought to the earth and igniting everything it touched. Urza felt the flash for a moment and smiled as it washed over him. His last sight was of his brother, melded to the machine as both were caught in the blast. The smile on his brother's face turned into a twisted parody as the systems of his body failed, and the Mishra dragon reduced to its smallest particles, and those particles were caught by the force of the explosion Urza had called into being. They were blown far, far away, and Urza was gone as well. Argoth died at last. Those survivors in the land only had a moment to react to the great flash of light on the horizon, when suddenly it was on top of them. The surviving trees ignited where they stood, blown down by the wind, their stumps uprooted by the undulating earth as ground slid beneath the sea, and new earth shot up from the force of the explosion. Gaia screamed as the circle of destruction widened. The men on Harbin's ships, who had been looking south, were blinded by the light, their eyes reduced to pools of blood from the intensity. The masts and sails of the ship were set afire by the heat, The ship was suddenly rising as the sea itself became a mountain and carried the boat with it. The ship rose upward, and Harbin clung to the tattered remains of the rigging, screaming his father's name. All at once the boat and the man were atop the great swell of the ocean, and Harbin could see, far to the south, the reddish glow of the sky as Argoth burned. He could see other swells, each larger than the one that had just overtaken them, advancing like relentless armies. His ship was cast down again into the ocean. Gwenna felt the ground tremble beneath her and heard the cry of Gaia as her land died. They were fighting Corlesians along the coast, and many of the warriors on both sides now cast down their weapons and began to weep. The war was over, and there were to be no victors. Gwenna noticed the sea was gone, leaving only broad patches of mud and rock. She realized what that meant. She shouted for her warriors to flee to the hills inland and broke into a loping run. She did not see which ones obeyed her. She was halfway up the nearest hill when the first great waves, each the size of a small mountain, broke against the coastline, smashing everything in their path. In Penregon, Kayla set down her pen at the sound of a distant thunder. But the thunder did not diminish, but instead became louder and was soon accompanied by the rushing of winds. The ground shook beneath her, and in another room there was the sound of dishes clattering to the floor. The room was rocked. The furniture slid against the far wall and was smashed. To the south there was a great reddish glow, as if all the southern Argive had caught fire. The door flew open, and Jarsel, Harbin's eldest, came in, crying and clutching one of his father's old toys, a mechanical bird that Tanos had made for him. Kayla hugged the child and whispered soft words to him, as outside the house men screamed and buildings toppled, and a single tear ran down the side of her face as she comforted her grandchild. In the caverns of Koilos, the air wrinkled and pursed, and there was a smell of burning oil as Gix returned to his lair. He had been damaged, and his movements left greasy footprints and spatters of oil. There was human blood on him as well, on his chest, his talons, and his face, but he had no time to consider his appearance. He worked quickly, one part of his mind calculating how long it would take for the blast wave to reach him, another wondering if the mountain itself would be sufficient protection, while a third part readied the Thran machine. A loose pile of power crystals was placed in the holder that he hoped would once again carry the united Weakstone and Mightstone, and his blood-stained hands moved over the glyphs with hurried grace. The air began to swirl and form its gateway, but it was not yet fully formed when the earth shook beneath his feet. The front of the blast wave was surging up the canyon outside. Gix leapt up the steps to the dais and looked around. Already parts of the ceiling were beginning to cave in, and the machines were sparking and going dead. Gix cursed and dived through the small portal feet first. As he dived, the portal winked shut around him. There was a scream from within the vaults, and then nothing, save for a demon's arm, severed at the elbow, clenching and unclenching at something that it could not attain, lying on the floor of the nearest room. Near the foot of the Ronum Glacier, Felden and Lauren watched as the great dust storm swallowed the foothills far below. The sand had been drawn from the desert hundreds of miles away and now flayed everything in the lowlands. Even at their height, a hot, dust-landed wind swept over them. Lauren pulled her cloak tight with her left arm. Beneath the cloak, her right arm was twisted and a mangled remnant. Felden surveyed the terrain below as one valley after another disappeared beneath the blast, leaving only a churned fog of dust and despair that was already trying to climb their mountain. The lower peaks were already vanishing beneath the assault. "Well," he said at last. "It's over," Lauren said. "Good." And there was silence in Terrasair. Epilogues, Diverging Paths, 64 AR. The dreams had called them. From the now ruined monastery and from the glass-paved lands of Yosha, from the abandoned wreckage of Tamakul, and from hidden places within the old coastal kingdoms. They brought with them their inventions, their devices, and their notes on the nature of magic. The dreams beckoned them to the secret heart of the Thran, to the cavern of Koilos, and they obeyed. They dug out the passage where it had caved in. They buried the bodies they found there and made a reliquary for the great demon's arm they found, eternally twitching at the foot of the dais. They repaired the machines as best as they were able, guided by the old knowledge and by their dreams. At last they were finished, and they placed the broken and fading power crystals in their holders, touching the glyphs as they had been instructed. The machines hummed and sputtered and came to a slow, flickering life. Slowly the air pursued and a swirling pool appeared, a gateway into a promised land beyond. Through the gate came a long mechanical arm, tipped with talons, mate to the one they had venerated as the arm of Gix. The arm beckoned to them and withdrew back into its own lands, and a voice rang out from the gate.
"Enter, my children," it said. "Enter and taste paradise."
Smiling, the priests of the Brotherhood of Gix stepped up to the gateway and entered Phyrexia. What had once been a verdant coastline was now awash with debris. The flotsam of great trees and the jetsam of huge boulders had been driven miles into shore, creating a blasted region along the shore devoid of life. Among the wreckage was a large metal box, 7 feet in length, 3 feet in width and height. It had weathered the destruction and came to rest among the other far-flung remains of what had been Argoth. Urza stood alongside the box and pressed his hands against the lid. The box's lid slid along its casters, revealing the slumbering form of his former apprentice. Tanos took a breath and sat bolt upright, gasping for air. His face was pale, and he was covered with dead skin that had flaked off but had nowhere to go within the confinement. Urza waited for Tanos to regain his composure, standing as patient as a statue. Tanos took a deep breath, held it, then took a second one. Then he looked around at the devastation that surrounded them. "It is over," said Urza, sitting on the edge of the box. Tanos gulped and looked around. "This was the safest hiding place I could think of," he said. Urza did not reply. Tanos said, "Your brother?" "Dead," said Urza. He shook his head. "The demon, the Phyrexian, killed my brother long ago. I never realized it." "Where are we?" asked Tanos. Urza looked around and sighed, deeply. "The southern coast of Yosha." Tanos blinked. "It has changed." "The world has changed," said Urza. "Because of what we did. Because of what I did." Tanos climbed out of the box and Urza helped him. Tanos felt weak from his incarceration and rubbed his arms and legs, both to shake off the dead skin and to restore circulation. It was cold on this shore, colder than Tanos remembered it as a youth. "I need one last task from you, my former student," said Urza. "Name it," said Tanos. "I want you to go west. Find the remains of the Union, the scholars of the Ivory Towers. Tell them what happened here. Tell them what we did and what we failed to do. See to it that they do not do the same. I trust you to do this." Tanos looked at the older man, but it seemed to him that Urza was no longer old. His hair was blond again, and his shoulders straight. But his eyes were old beyond years and pained beyond mortal hurt. "You can always trust me," said Tanos. "Where are you going?" Urza turned from his former pupil. "Away," he said after a short while. "I am going away." "It looks as if we could use your help here," said Tanos. Urza made a noise that Tanos thought was a nervous laugh. "I don't think the land could survive any more of my help. I need to go away and think by myself, where I will not harm others." Tanos nodded and said, "I don't know if there is any place that far away." Urza shook his head and said, "There are places far beyond the land of Terrasayer, far beyond the world of Dominaria. When I poured my memories into the Silex, I saw them. I see many things that I have never seen before." He turned back to Tanos, and the Master Scholar saw Urza's eyes. They were no longer human eyes, but rather 2 gemstones, radiating with a cascade of multicolored hues: green, white, red, black, and blue. Might Stone and Weak Stone, reunited at last within the surviving brother. The image was only for an instant, then Urza's eyes were normal again. Urza smiled. "I must go away," he repeated. Tanos nodded slowly, and the man with the human crystalline eyes stood. "You have long been a student," said Urza. "Now go be a teacher." As he spoke, Urza began to fade from view. Slowly, the color drained from him, leaving only outlines, and they too faded. "Teach them of our triumphs and our mistakes," said a distant voice. "And tell Kayla to remember me not." "As you were, but you tried to be," finished Tanos. But he was speaking to empty space. Urza had passed from the world into greater worlds that only his crystalline eyes could see. Tanos looked around, but there was no sign of life. He struck inland, hoping to get past the worst of devastation before he had to travel west. He recognized no familiar landmarks, and he had a feeling that he would not for a long time. Tanos wondered how bad the devastation truly was, and as Tanos walked inland, he was greeted by the first flakes of snow drifting down a chill wind.